August 15th, 1559. Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The air in the Queen's chambers is thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of beeswax, wilting lilies, and palpable dread. It clings to the black mourning silks of Catherine de' Medici, a woman whose grief is a cold, hard diamond of fury and fear. Outside, a sweltering summer day beats down on a kingdom suddenly without a king, a kingdom adrift. But in here, a penetrating chill emanates from the very stones of the castle, a cold that has nothing to do with the weather. Before the formidable Queen Regent stands a man who seems utterly out of place, a provincial doctor from Salon, Michel de Notre Dame. He is in his 50s, stout, with a graying beard, and the weary eyes of a man who has seen too much death, both at the plague beds and, allegedly, in the terrifying expanse of time itself. Less than a month ago, his king, Henry II, was alive, the embodiment of chivalric power. Now he is dead, a shard of a broken lance having pierced his eye and brain in a festive joust. And this doctor's obscure, poetic verse, published years earlier, now screams across the court, a prophecy fulfilled in the most gruesome detail. The young lion will overcome the older one. On the field of combat in a single battle, he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death. The words hang in the air between them, more real than the throne she now protects for her frail son. The shock is not just in the death, it is in the chilling possibility that the universe is not random, that its secrets can be read, not by princes or popes, but by this unassuming apothecary. Catherine's voice, when it comes, is a dangerous whisper, a serpent's hiss. She does not ask if he is a fraud. It is too late for that. The stakes are now infinitely higher. She demands to know what else he has seen, what future awaits her other sons, her dynasty, her kingdom. In this moment, Nostradamus ceases to be a mere curio, a writer of strange poems. He becomes a mirror reflecting the deepest fears of an age, and the penetrating chill in the room is the sudden, terrifying realization that the future might already be written, and its author is this quiet man whose hands smell of herbs and ink. This is the narrative of him, Michel de Notre Dame, the man who would become a myth. This was the saga of an apothecary who stood at the crossroads of a dying medieval world and a dawning, violent modernity, a man of science who became the most enduring prophet in history. To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world of superstition and burgeoning reason, of apocalyptic faith and clinical observation. The central dramatic paradox of his life is the very question that hung in that suffocating room with the Queen. How? How did a physician, a man trained to observe symptoms, diagnose fevers, and ground himself in the tangible reality of the human body, become a seer who spoke the language of the stars and claimed to witness the fates of empires yet to be born? Was his mind a conduit for divine revelation, a channel opened by unbearable personal tragedy? Or was he a genius of a different kind, a master psychologist and historian who understood the cyclical, brutal nature of human history so profoundly that he could project its patterns centuries forward, clothing his deductions in the deliberately obscure language of poetry to protect himself from the fires of the Inquisition? Was Nostradamus a prophet who saw the future, or a poet who created a future for his prophecies to inhabit? The script of his life is written in the invisible ink of this ambiguity. He was a product of an era that desperately needed answers, a world reeling from plague, schism, and incessant war, an age that would look at a man who mixed potions for the body and willingly believe he could also write prescriptions for the soul of the world. His story is not just about predicting the future. It is about humanity's eternal, desperate desire to believe that the terrifying chaos of existence has a hidden order, a secret text, and that one man, through some dark miracle, was given the key to decipher it. To understand Nostradamus, we must first feel the pulse of his time, the feverish, violent rhythm of the 16th century. This was a world on the brink, a civilization holding its breath before a coming storm. The great geopolitical chessboard was a blood-soaked mosaic of collapsing powers and rising threats. To the east, the formidable Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was a steel avalanche pressing against the heart of Europe, its shadow falling over the Mediterranean, a constant and terrifying other in the Christian imagination. The memory of the fall of Constantinople was still a fresh wound, a reminder of the fragility of Christendom. In the heart of the continent, the great rivalry between the Valois dynasty of France and the sprawling Habsburg Empire of Spain and Austria defined generations of warfare, a relentless struggle for dominance that drained treasuries and bled nations white. This was the era of the Italian Wars, where new technologies of death, like gunpowder and cannon, turned battlefields into hellish forges of unimaginable carnage. But the most profound conflict was not between empires, but within souls. The Protestant Reformation, unleashed by Martin Luther decades earlier, had shattered the 1,500-year-old unity of the Western Church, plunging Europe into a vortex of religious hatred. In France, this schism took the form of a simmering civil war between the Catholic majority and the rising Protestant minority, the Huguenots. Every town, every noble family was divided. The air was thick with the poison of theological debate, fanaticism, and the promise of holy war. This was the world Nostradamus inhabited, a world where divine favor was seen in every victory and demonic influence in every defeat. It was an age of profound anxiety, where the old certainties were dissolving, and people looked to the heavens not just for salvation, but for information, for a sign that someone was in control. It was the perfect breeding ground for a prophet. In this cauldron of geopolitical strife and spiritual crisis, a man who could offer even a glimmer of certainty, however veiled or terrifying, was not just a curiosity. He was a necessity. The origins of this man were as complex and contradictory as his prophecies. Born in 1503 in Saint-Rémy de Provence, Michel de Nostradame was a child of the borderlands, not just geographically, but culturally and spiritually. His family bore an ancestral curse that was both a source of intellectual richness and mortal danger. They were conversos, Jews who had converted to Catholicism under the threat of expulsion or death a generation or two earlier. This heritage placed them in a precarious position, forever viewed with suspicion by the long arm of the Holy Inquisition. Yet, it also likely endowed young Michel with a unique legacy, a tradition of scholarship, a familiarity with Hebrew texts, and perhaps a grounding in the mystical traditions of the Kabbalah that ran parallel to mainstream Christian doctrine. This duality would define him, a devout Catholic in public, yet a man whose intellectual world was far wider and more esoteric than that of his peers. His path seemed destined for the world of reason, however. He was sent to study at the prestigious University of Montpellier, one of Europe's finest medical schools. There, in the anatomical theaters and botanical gardens, he was forged in the crucible of Renaissance humanism and empirical observation. He learned to dissect the body, to understand the properties of herbs, to trust what his hands could feel and his eyes could see. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and dedicated student. But the 16th century had a brutal way of teaching the limits of human reason. The Black Death was not a distant memory. Its recurring waves were a constant, terrifying reality. After his studies, Nostradamus, now a licensed physician, faced this horror directly. It was in the plague pits of southern France that his character was truly forged. And it was there that he suffered the single greatest trauma of his life. Despite his growing fame as a plague doctor, he was powerless to save his own first wife and 2 young children from the disease. They were consumed by the pestilence, leaving him utterly broken. This was the moment the man of science stared into the abyss and found his knowledge wanting. The universe, he discovered, was not a rational, ordered place governed by the laws of medicine. It was a realm of capricious, overwhelming force. This personal catastrophe, this profound failure of his craft, became the secret engine of his transformation. It was the wound that never healed, the inner demon that would drive him from the world of tangible cures into the shadowy, uncertain realm of prophecy, in a desperate, lifelong search for a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of control over the forces of fate. His first steps onto the public stage were not as a whispering seer in a darkened room, but as a pragmatic combatant in the war against death. Before he was Nostradamus the prophet, he was Maître Michel the plague doctor, a figure of hope and controversy walking through the charnel houses of Provence. The sensory assault of a plague-stricken city was the world he inhabited. Imagine the sounds, the constant mournful tolling of church bells, the rumble of the death carts on cobblestone streets, the whispered prayers, and the sudden, wrenching shrieks of grief from behind closed doors. Imagine the smells, the cloying, sweet stench of decay mixed with the acrid smoke of vinegar fires and burning bundles of herbs, a futile attempt to purify the poisoned air. In this landscape of horror, Nostradamus distinguished himself not through magic, but through a radical, almost heretical application of common sense. While many of his colleagues relied on the traditional practices of bleeding and purging, treatments that often weakened the patient further, he championed a different approach. He was a fierce advocate for sanitation, for the removal of infected corpses, for fresh air and clean water. This was his first great game, a battle against the established medical dogma of his time. His most famous innovation was the rose pill, a lozenge made from rose hips, cypress, iris, and other ingredients. While its medicinal properties were likely negligible, its core component, rose hips, was rich in vitamin C, possibly offering a small boost to the immune systems of the malnourished. More importantly, his regimen insisted on a level of hygiene that was revolutionary for the era. He fought not just the disease, but the ignorance and filth that allowed it to fester. His success in cities like Aix-en-Provence brought him his first taste of fame, a reputation as a man who could stare down the pestilence and win. He was lauded by city councils, rewarded with pensions, and seen as a miracle worker. But this early success was built on a foundation of reason and observation, the very tools that had failed him so catastrophically with his own family. This early chapter of his life is crucial to understanding the man he would become. He had seen the limits of science. He had learned that you could save a city and still lose your world. This tension between the celebrated doctor, who fought the physical manifestations of chaos, and the broken man who yearned to understand its ultimate source, was the fertile ground from which the prophet would grow. The inner demon that drove Nostradamus was not a lust for power or a hunger for fame, but a ghost. Or rather, 3 ghosts, the specters of his dead wife and his 2 children. Their loss was the central defining cataclysm of his existence, a psychological wound from which the dark river of his prophetic work would flow. To comprehend the man, one must attempt to stand in his shoes in the aftermath of that tragedy. He was a celebrated physician, a man whose entire professional identity was built on the premise of healing, of understanding the mechanics of life and death. And yet, when the great test came, when the pestilence entered his own home, his knowledge turned to ash. All his learning, all his unconventional treatments, all his carefully prepared remedies were utterly useless. He was reduced to the most primal state of human helplessness, a father and husband watching his loved ones die. This failure did not just break his heart, it shattered his worldview. It was a profound crisis of faith, not in God, but in the ordered, rational universe that the Renaissance mind was beginning to map and comprehend. If his science was a lie, a flimsy shield against an indifferent and monstrous fate, then where could truth be found? This question became his secret motivation, a relentless, obsessive quest. His turn towards the occult, towards astrology, scrying, and the obscure arts of divination was not the act of a charlatan seeking a new trade. It was the desperate journey of a drowning man searching for a hidden logic behind the wave that had just destroyed his world. He sought to find a larger pattern, a cosmic order that could explain the senseless suffering he had witnessed. If he could not control death with medicine, perhaps he could understand its design by reading the stars or gazing into the flames. This was his great, secret ambition, to find a vantage point from which the chaos of human existence resolved into a predictable, knowable system. It was a way to retroactively give meaning to his loss, to believe that his family's death was not a random accident, but a part of some vast, terrible, and ultimately intelligible tapestry. The prophecies, in their earliest form, were likely a form of personal therapy, an attempt to impose order on his own trauma by projecting it onto the grand screen of history. He was a man trying to heal a wound in his own soul by attempting to diagnose the future of all humanity. The trajectory of a man like Nostradamus, balanced precariously between the worlds of science and the occult, could have easily ended in obscurity or at the stake. What propelled him from the status of a provincial crank to a figure of international renown was a fateful encounter, an alliance with the single most powerful and superstitious woman in 16th century Europe, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France. Catherine was an enigma herself, a product of the Medici banking dynasty of Florence, a city steeped in both Renaissance humanism and ancient esoteric traditions. She was a shrewd, ruthless political operator, a survivor who would navigate the treacherous currents of the French court and the wars of religion for 3 decades. But beneath the calculating exterior was a mind deeply obsessed with the supernatural. She traveled with her own retinue of astrologers and soothsayers, constantly seeking to glimpse the future, to gain an edge in the deadly game of thrones. For Catherine, astrology was not a parlor game. It was a form of strategic intelligence. When rumors of the prophet from Provence, the man whose strange verses were circulating among the literate elite, reached her, her interest was immediate and intense. She summoned him to court in Paris in 1556, a meeting that would define both their destinies. This was not merely a meeting of a seer and a patron. It was a collision of 2 powerful forces of the age. In Nostradamus, Catherine saw a potential tool, a source of secret knowledge that could help her protect her husband, King Henry II, and secure the future of her Valois sons. In Catherine, Nostradamus found the ultimate shield. A summons to the Queen could easily have been a prelude to an interrogation by the Inquisition. But with her patronage, he was suddenly untouchable. She was the one person in the kingdom whose power could protect him from the theologians who saw his work as demonic. Their relationship was a complex symbiosis of belief and manipulation. She craved his predictions, and he, in turn, fed her that information, likely couched in the most careful, ambiguous language. He had found his audience, and she had found her prophet. This alliance was the crucible in which his legend was forged. Without Catherine de' Medici, Nostradamus might have been a forgotten footnote. With her, he was granted a stage at the very center of power, a platform from which his cryptic words would soon echo across the centuries. The publication of the first edition of Les Prophéties in 1555 was the moment Maître Michel de Nostradame threw down a dangerous gauntlet to the world. This was his first true step into the great game of prophecy, and the price of admission was immediate and severe. The book, a collection of rhyming four-line stanzas called quatrains, grouped in centuries of 100, was unlike anything seen before. It was not a straightforward apocalyptic text in the tradition of the Bible. It was a chaotic, non-chronological jumble of images, symbols, and enigmatic pronouncements. The response was a firestorm of controversy. The academic and literary elite of Paris, the guardians of reason and classical form, largely dismissed the work with contempt. They saw it as the nonsensical gibberish of a provincial mind, a clumsy mishmash of Latin, Greek, and Provençal French, devoid of poetic grace or logical coherence. To them, he was a charlatan of the worst kind, preying on the fears of the ignorant. But the scorn of intellectuals was the least of his worries. A far greater threat came from the Church. In an age where any deviation from orthodox doctrine could lead to the stake, the act of predicting the future was fraught with peril. It was seen as an encroachment on the sovereignty of God, a form of magic that smacked of demonic compact. Theologians and inquisitors began to circle, examining his verses for any hint of heresy. Accusations began to fly, that he was a secret Calvinist, a sorcerer, a tool of the devil. Nostradamus was walking a razor's edge. He had to create a work that was compelling enough to attract powerful patrons, but ambiguous enough to offer him plausible deniability. This is why the language of the centuries is so famously obscure. It was a deliberate strategy of survival. The vague timelines, the symbolic beasts, the anagrams of names and places, all of it was a smokescreen. He was creating a text that could be interpreted in countless ways, ensuring that he could never be definitively pinned down to a single, falsifiable, and therefore heretical prediction. The price of his new power was constant, gnawing fear. Each verse he published was a gamble, an act that brought him closer to the ear of the Queen, but also a step closer to the flames of the Inquisitor's pyre. The primary antagonist Nostradamus faced was not a single person, not a rival sorcerer or a scheming courtier, but something far more powerful and pervasive, the spirit of the age itself. He was a man caught in the violent crosscurrents of two immense and opposing historical forces. On one side was the monolithic power of the Old World, the Holy Inquisition. This was the ideological enforcement arm of the Catholic Church, an institution engaged in a desperate existential struggle to maintain doctrinal purities in the face of the Protestant Reformation. To the mind of the Inquisitor, the universe was a battlefield between God and Satan, and any unexplained phenomenon, any claim to supernatural knowledge outside the Church's strict authority, was immediately suspect. Nostradamus's work was, to them, a profound threat. If a mere doctor could truly read the future, it implied that the future was knowable, perhaps even predetermined, a concept that dangerously flirted with heresy. They saw the devil's hand in his cryptic methodology, the late-night rituals, the use of mirrors or bowls of water, and heard the serpent's whisper in his ambiguous verses. The threat of investigation, torture, and a horrific death by fire was not an abstract danger. It was a constant, looming reality for any man who dabbled in the occult arts in the 16th century. Yet, on the other side, Nostradamus faced a newer, but equally formidable adversary, the burgeoning spirit of scientific rationalism. This was the dawn of the age that would produce Francis Bacon and René Descartes. A new generation of thinkers, scholars, and physicians were beginning to champion empirical evidence, logical deduction, and the rejection of superstition. To these men, Nostradamus wasn't a demon, he was a fraud. They subjected his work to logical scrutiny and found it wanting. They ridiculed his convoluted syntax, exposed his historical predictions as vague descriptions of past events, and dismissed his entire enterprise as a cynical exploitation of public fear. He was thus trapped in an impossible position. The men of faith wanted to burn him as a heretic, while the men of reason wanted to expose him as a charlatan. His entire career was a high-wire act performed over this chasm, a desperate attempt to navigate between the competing fundamentalisms of an age of violent transition. The perilous journey to Paris in 1556, undertaken at the summons of the Queen, marked a critical psychological turning point for Nostradamus. It was here that he learned the single most important lesson of his prophetic career. Clarity is death. Ambiguity is survival. Fresh from the success of his book's publication, he arrived in the capital a celebrity, but also a target. He was lodged in the palace, consulted by the great nobles of the realm, and showered with questions about the future. In this intoxicating environment, it appears he made a nearly fatal error. According to one account, he was asked about the fate of the king and the political situation. Flushed with his newfound importance, he may have given an answer that was too specific, too clear, hinting at conspiracies or dangers surrounding the powerful House of Guise. The exact nature of the prophecy is lost to history, but its effect was immediate. Word of his treasonous prediction reached his enemies at court. Suddenly, the Queen's favor seemed a very distant thing. The authorities of Paris issued a warrant for his arrest. He was to be brought before the magistrates for questioning, a process that could easily have ended with a charge of treason and a swift, brutal execution. A wave of cold terror must have washed over him. He was a provincial, a man unversed in the lethal intrigues of the royal court. He had miscalculated, spoken too plainly, and was about to pay the ultimate price. He managed to escape Paris just in time, fleeing back to the relative safety of his home in Salon. This experience was a psychological breaking point. It was a searing lesson in the politics of prophecy. He understood in that moment that his gift, whether real or feigned, was also a mortal liability. To survive, he could no longer be a transparent oracle. He had to become a master of obfuscation. He had to forge a new language, a prophetic style so dense with metaphor, so devoid of clear subjects or timelines, that it could support a multitude of interpretations after the fact, but never be used to condemn him beforehand. The famous obscurity of his quatrains was not just a literary choice, it was a shield, a suit of armor forged in the fires of his Paris humiliation. He realized that his power lay not in revealing the future, but in creating a text where people could discover the future for themselves long after the event had passed, leaving him safely out of reach of the executioner's axe. For 4 years, the prophecies of Michel de Nostradame remained a subject of debate and ridicule, a curious collection of obscure verses. But on July 10, 1559, a single, catastrophic event transformed them into a text of terrifying authority. Chaos became his greatest opportunity. The scene was a grand celebration in the heart of Paris, a festival to mark a new peace treaty and the marriage of the king's daughter. King Henry II, a man in his prime at 40 years old, a lover of sport and a powerful monarch, decided to participate in the jousting tournament himself. It was a display of royal vigor and martial prowess. In the final pass of the day, he ran against the young captain of his Scottish Guard, the Comte de Montgomery. A sensory assault of splintering wood, the thunder of hooves, the gasp of the crowd. The lances struck. Montgomery's shattered, and a long, sharp splinter flew up, punching through the gilt bars of the king's helmet, his golden cage. The shard entered his right eye, piercing deep into his brain. The king reeled in the saddle, mortally wounded. For 10 agonizing days, the finest surgeons in Europe, including the great anatomist Vesalius, tried in vain to save him. He died in excruciating pain. In that instant of Henry's death, Nostradamus was reborn. A shockwave ran through the courts of Europe. Someone remembered the strange verse from the book published 4 years prior, Quatrain 135. The young lion will overcome the older one, on the field of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made 1. Then he dies a cruel death. The parallels were stunning, uncanny, and impossible to ignore. The older king, the older one, defeated by a younger man, the young lion. The battlefield of the tournament, field of combat. The gruesome, specific detail of the eye pierced through the helmet, golden cage. The 2 wounds, the eye and the brain, becoming 1 fatal injury. 2 wounds made 1. The prophecy was no longer a vague piece of doggerel. It was a chillingly precise account of a freak accident. This single event was the fulcrum on which his entire legacy turned. It silenced the skeptics and terrified the powerful. He had used the ambient chaos and violence of his age as a canvas, and now a random stroke of fate had painted a masterpiece of horror upon it, validating his entire project. From this moment on, Nostradamus was no longer just a doctor who wrote poetry. He was the man who had seen the king's death written in the stars. The death of the king transformed Nostradamus from a person of interest into an object of absolute necessity for the new ruler of France, the Queen Regent, Catherine de' Medici. His greatest triumph was not the fulfillment of the prophecy itself, but the access it granted him. The summons to the royal court was now not a request, but a desperate plea. He was brought before a terrified mother who now held the fate of a fractured kingdom in her hands, a kingdom she had to rule on behalf of her sickly, adolescent son, Francis II. The climax of his ascent was the private audience that followed, a scene steeped in drama and a palpable sense of the supernatural. Catherine, no longer just curious, but a true believer, did not want vague pronouncements about the kingdom. She wanted to know the fate of her bloodline, the future of her 4 young sons, Francis, Charles, Henry, and the youngest, Hercule. What Nostradamus did next was a masterstroke of psychological theater. He did not, according to the legends that grew around this meeting, offer detailed prophecies. Instead, he simply observed the boys, the heirs to the throne of France. He looked at the frail Francis, already king but destined to die within a year. He looked at the nervous, unstable Charles, who would one day authorize the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and die haunted by its bloody ghosts. He looked at the intelligent, athletic Henry, who would rule as king of both Poland and France before being felled by an assassin's knife. And he looked at the ambitious youngest son, who would never sit on the throne. We can only imagine the scene, the seer, with his dark, knowing eyes, gazing upon the royal children as if they were already ghosts, their entire tragic biographies playing out before him. He is said to have remarked that all of them would be kings, a prophecy in itself, as the last son would not inherit the throne, yet it hinted at the bloody succession to come. The true power of this moment was in its intimacy and its implication. By reading the fate of her children, he was no longer a distant author. He was an intimate confidant, a spiritual advisor, who held the most sensitive secrets of the dynasty. He had transcended politics. He had made himself essential to the mother of kings, securing his position and his legend, and wrapping himself in the ultimate protection of the throne. At the absolute summit of his power and influence, what were the thoughts of Nostradamus, the man? To understand the psychology of his triumph, we must imagine him in his sanctuary, the secluded study at the top of his house in Salon, the world of queens and courts left far behind. This room was his true kingdom, a space filled with the tools of his dual trades, the physician's charts and herbal remedies on one side, the astronomer's astrolabes, celestial maps, and forbidden esoteric texts on the other. Here, in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the scent of old parchment and drying herbs, the moment of hubris would have been overwhelming. Did he, in these solitary hours, truly believe he was a vessel for the divine, a conduit chosen by God to reveal the grand, terrible design of history? It is entirely possible. The sheer unlikeliness of his own story, a provincial doctor becoming the confidant of a queen because of a single verse written years before, could easily be interpreted as a sign of divine favor, a miracle validating his sacred mission. He might have seen himself as a new Isaiah, a prophet sent to warn a sinful and complacent generation. The nightly rituals he practiced, using meditative techniques and possibly hallucinogenic herbs like nutmeg to induce a trance state, could have produced genuine psychological visions, powerful waking dreams that his conscious mind would then struggle to interpret and record. In this state, the line between insight and divine inspiration would have blurred completely. Alternatively, a different kind of hubris might have taken hold. The pride of the master craftsman, the ultimate intellectual gamesman. He might have seen himself not as a prophet, but as a brilliant political analyst and historian who had discovered the timeless, cyclical patterns of human conflict. He knew that kingdoms rise and fall, that peace is always a prelude to war, that ambition always leads to bloodshed. Perhaps he saw his prophecies as elegant, poetically coded expressions of these iron laws of history, so universal that they were bound to come true eventually. The triumph was not in seeing the future, but in creating a system so flexible it could never be proven wrong. In either case, the feeling must have been one of incredible power, the knowledge that the words he was scratching onto paper in this small, quiet room would shape the fears and decisions of the most powerful people on earth. While Nostradamus enjoyed the dangerous patronage of the Queen, he was by no means without enemies. His rise to prominence created a host of sworn adversaries, and his intellectual and spiritual duel with them was a battle for the soul of the nation. The opposition was not a monolithic bloc, it was a coalition of the threatened. It included rival astrologers at court, jealous of this newcomer from Provence who had so completely captured the Queen's ear. It included skeptical poets and scholars who were offended by his crude style and his grand claims, seeing him as an insult to their craft. But his most dangerous personal antagonist was found in the figure of the stern, rational theologian, a man like Laurent Vidal. Vidal was one of the first to publish a direct, scathing attack on Nostradamus in 1558, a book titled Declaration of the Abuses, Ignorances, and Seditions of Michel Nostradamus. He represented a specific and formidable type of enemy, the educated, logical debunker. Vidal did not attack Nostradamus on the grounds of heresy alone. He dissected his work with the sharp scalpel of a scholar. He meticulously went through the quatrains, demonstrating their grammatical errors, their historical inaccuracies, and their deliberate vagueness. He argued, compellingly, that Nostradamus was a poor poet, a worse historian, and a cynical manipulator. He painted a portrait of a fraud, who either copied vague prophecies from earlier sources like the Mirabilis Liber, or simply wrote verses so nonsensical they could be applied to any event. The chemistry of their conflict was the classic clash between the mystic and the rationalist. For Vidal and his ilk, Nostradamus was a symptom of a societal disease, a regression into superstition at a time when the light of reason was beginning to dawn. He was a purveyor of fear, a man who profited from chaos. This was not just a literary debate, it was a deeply personal and dangerous feud. Vidal's book publicly branded Nostradamus a seditious liar, an accusation that could easily attract the attention of the Inquisition. The duel between them was fought with pamphlets and public opinion, a high-stakes battle between two worldviews, one that saw the hand of fate in every shadow, and one that sought to banish the shadows with the harsh light of critical thought. Unlike a king or a general, the great construction project of Nostradamus was not one of stone or law, but of words and fear. His monumental reform was the creation of his magnum opus, the centuries, and his primary tool was the nightly ritual he conducted in his secret study. This process was his method of construction, the deliberate building of a legend, and it was a sensory assault on his own consciousness. The legend begins after his family was asleep, when the house in Ceylon grew silent. He would ascend to his sanctum, a room forbidden to others. The air would be cool, the only sound the distant barking of a dog or the sighing of the wind. He would light a single candle, its flame a tiny defiant star against the crushing darkness of the provincial night. On his table, he would place the artifacts of his ritual, as described in his own opening verses: a brass tripod, a small bowl of water, and a wand. The scene is deliberately evocative of the ancient oracles of Greece. The process was one of self-induced hypnosis. He would gaze into the water, or perhaps the flame, for hours, the single point of light mesmerizing him, silencing the rational, critical part of his mind. He wrote of using herbal preparations, likely mild hallucinogens like nutmeg or morning glory seeds, to anoint himself and his wand, further loosening his grip on ordinary reality. The smells would be of burning herbs, melting wax, and the dry dust of ancient books. In this trance-like state, a state of profound sensory deprivation and psychological suggestion, the visions would come. They were likely not clear, cinematic previews of the future, but a flood of disconnected, symbolic images, a torrent of chaotic input from his subconscious mind, dredged up from his vast reading of history, mythology, and the Bible. His great work was to capture this chaotic flood, to wrestle these fleeting images into the rigid, four-line structure of a quatrain. The construction of the centuries was therefore a nightly descent into a self-made abyss, a painstaking process of translating the language of dreams and nightmares into a text that would haunt the waking world for centuries. He was not merely writing a book, he was building a labyrinth of words, a textual machine designed to generate an endless supply of meaning and dread. To truly understand the paradox of Nostradamus, one must look beyond the apocalyptic seer and see the man who lived a remarkably conventional life. This zoom effect, contrasting the macro-level prophet with the close-up of the provincial bourgeois, is essential. While his nights were spent conversing with eternity, his days were grounded in the mundane realities of 16th-century life, a stability largely provided by his second wife, Anne Boleyn. After the devastating loss of his first family, he remarried a wealthy widow. Anne was, by all accounts, a practical, capable woman who ran their household with efficiency, managed the considerable fortune he earned from his medical practice and publications, and bore him 6 children. She was the anchor that kept his strange ship moored to the real world. One can imagine the domestic scenes, the great prophet of doom arguing with his wife over the price of grain, or helping one of his children with their Latin lessons. This domesticity provided a crucial cover and a necessary balance. To his neighbors in the town of Ceylon, he was not primarily a sorcerer. He was a respected citizen, a man of property and standing. He participated in civic life, even serving for a time as town consul, dealing with practical matters like irrigation projects and local taxes. This public persona was his most effective defense against his enemies. How could a man so grounded, so involved in the day-to-day business of the community, be a demonic wizard trafficking with dark forces? This contrast was the core of his existence. He was a man of two worlds, the sunlit world of the marketplace, family dinners, and civic duty, and the nocturnal world of the secret study, of terrifying visions and cosmic dread. This duality was not just a lifestyle, it was a psychological necessity. The ordinary, predictable rhythms of his family life provided the psychic stability required to explore the chaotic, terrifying landscapes of his prophetic imagination. Without Anne and the grounding reality of his life as a husband, father, and citizen, the seer would have likely been consumed by the very darkness he sought to channel. As the years passed and his fame grew, the world began to catch up with his dark visions. The first cracks in the fragile peace of France appeared, heralding the storm that would become the French Wars of Religion. This brutal series of conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots, which would last for more than 30 years and tear the kingdom apart, became the proving ground for his prophecies. But it also revealed a terrible danger. His work was no longer his own. His cryptic quatrains became a weapon in a vicious propaganda war. Each side, the Catholic League and the Protestant Huguenots, began to mine the centuries for verses that could be interpreted as predicting their own ultimate victory and the damnation of their enemies. A quatrain mentioning a great famine could be applied to a city under siege. A reference to a change of reign could be used to justify the assassination of a king. His words, which he likely intended as universal warnings about the folly of human conflict, were twisted into specific, partisan justifications for slaughter. He became a prophet for hire, his verses endlessly reprinted in pamphlets with new, politically charged interpretations. This must have been a horrifying development for him. He had sought to understand the great patterns of history, but now he was seeing his own words being used as fuel for the very fires he claimed to foresee. The storm he had predicted was breaking, and his prophecies were like lightning rods, attracting and channeling the destructive energy of the age. The harbingers of this storm were not just political, they were personal. The more his name was invoked by fanatics on both sides, the more dangerous his position became. He was no longer just a royal curiosity. He was a political figure, whether he wanted to be or not. The cracks appearing in the kingdom were mirrored by the growing cracks in his own carefully constructed persona of the detached, objective seer. The world was spinning into a vortex of violence, and he was standing at its center, watching his own legacy being forged in the blood of his countrymen. In the last years of his life, increasingly frail and afflicted by illness, Nostradamus made a fateful decision: to publish the final 3 centuries of his work, containing his most apocalyptic and far-reaching prophecies. This was not a commercial decision. It was a profound psychological act, a final defiant gesture from a man who believed he had seen the end point of history. Why did he do it? What was the psychology behind this final, terrible unleashing of his visions upon the world? It was likely a combination of motivations, a cocktail of hubris, desperation, and a genuine sense of duty. By this point, he may have become a true believer in his own myth, having seen some of his predictions come to pass with uncanny accuracy. He might have felt a sacred obligation to reveal the rest of his knowledge, to give humanity a complete, if terrifying, roadmap of its future. It was the ultimate act of a prophet, to hold nothing back, to deliver the message in its entirety, regardless of the consequences. He may have seen the escalating religious violence in France as the beginning of the end times, the final act in a divine drama. In this mindset, publishing the final prophecies was not an act of ego, but a desperate final warning, a last chance for humanity to change its course before the coming apocalypse he foresaw. There was also likely an element of legacy building. Knowing that his life was drawing to a close, he wanted to complete his magnum opus, to leave behind a finished monument that would endure for ages. He was sealing his testament, ensuring that future generations would have the complete text to ponder and interpret. This act was the culmination of his life's work, the final placement of the capstone on the strange pyramid he had constructed. It was a profoundly fateful act because it guaranteed his immortality. By extending his prophecies to encompass the French Revolution, the rise of figures like Napoleon, pas you, ni Lauren, an anagram for Napoleon Roy, and even a figure he calls Hister, Hitler, and culminating in a final world-ending conflict, he ensured that every future generation would find itself somewhere in his dark timeline, forever searching for their own reflection in his cryptic verses. He was consciously throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean of time, a message he knew would be found and feared for centuries to come. The greatest catastrophe for a prophet is not to be proven wrong, but to be endlessly and crudely misunderstood. This was the ultimate moral catastrophe of Nostradamus's legacy, a tragedy that began even before his death and accelerated in the centuries that followed. He had created a work of immense subtlety and ambiguity, a complex tapestry woven from history, poetry, and visionary experience. He likely saw it as a profound, meditative text on the nature of fate and human folly. But the world had little patience for subtlety. It flattened his complex verses into a series of simple, sensationalist predictions, turning his life's work into a kind of supernatural tabloid. The true horror was watching his name become a brand, a synonym for cheap fortune-telling. He, the scholar who had studied Plato and Plutarch, was now lumped in with common street-corner soothsayers. This process, which he could see beginning in his own lifetime, was the great, unresolved tragedy of his work. He had unlocked, or believed he had unlocked, some of the deepest secrets of the cosmos, but the message was being garbled in transmission, twisted by the very people he sought to warn. In the centuries after his death, this catastrophe only deepened. His prophecies were selectively edited, taken out of context, and sometimes entirely fabricated by printers and publishers looking to capitalize on his fame. During times of crisis, wars, revolutions, natural disasters, new interpretations would flood the market, invariably twisting a quatrain to fit the events of the day. The Nazis' propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, famously dropped leaflets over occupied Europe containing Nostradamus quatrains reinterpreted to predict the victory of the Third Reich. He had become a tool for liars, a justification for tyrants. This was the ultimate, cruel irony. A man whose own family had fled persecution was now being used by one of history's greatest persecutors. The moral catastrophe was the utter loss of control over his creation. He had unleashed a powerful and dangerous text into the world, and like a sorcerer's apprentice, he had no power to command the forces it had unleashed. His legacy was not a clear warning, but a dark mirror in which humanity could project its own ugliest fears and ambitions, using his authority to sanctify their own violence and madness. As the chaos he had predicted in the macrocosm of the kingdom began to consume France, Nostradamus's own body, his personal microcosm, began to collapse. The final years of his life were a slow, painful surrender to the mundane frailties of the flesh. He was afflicted by severe gout, which inflamed his joints and made movement an agony, and by dropsy, edema, which caused his body to swell with fluid, making every breath a struggle. The great seer, who could roam across centuries, was now a prisoner in his own home, often confined to his bed. This physical decline was a stark, ironic counterpoint to his soaring reputation. While his name was being whispered in the courts of Europe, he himself was engaged in a losing battle against his own mortality. He was no longer the vigorous plague doctor who could march into infected cities. He was an old, sick man, watching the world through his window. Yet, even in this state of collapse, he made one last, desperate attempt to control the narrative, to stage-manage the final act of his own life. He knew he was dying, and he approached his own death as his final prophecy. He meticulously wrote his last will and testament, dictating the precise details of his burial. He insisted on being buried upright, encased within the wall of a local church, a bizarre request that was likely another piece of calculated myth-making, ensuring his final resting place would be as unconventional as his life. The most famous story of this period, perhaps apocryphal but perfectly in keeping with his character, concerns his last chance to assert his prophetic power. His secretary and friend, Chavigny, wished him a good night on the evening of July 1st, 1566. Nostradamus, aware of the finality of the moment, is said to have looked at him and uttered his last prediction. "You will not find me alive at sunrise." It was his last desperate attempt to hold on to power, to prove that even his own death was not a random biological event, but an appointment he had foreseen and was now keeping. He was turning his own end into a fulfillment, the final sealing of his legend. The hero's finale came not with a bang, not in a flash of celestial fire, but in the quiet, ignominious stillness of a provincial bedroom. On the morning of July 2nd, 1566, when his secretary entered his room, he found the prophecy fulfilled. Michel de Nostradame was dead, his body having finally surrendered to his illnesses. The cinematic scene of his last minutes is one of profound human irony. This was the man who claimed to have witnessed the clash of future armies, the fall of dynasties, and the birth of terrible antichrists. Yet his own end was a small, private affair, a struggle for breath in the dark. The prophet of fire and brimstone died of water, his lungs filling with the fluid of his dropsy. The man who spoke in the grand, high language of kings and empires was silenced by the prosaic betrayal of his own body. His last night must have been a crucible of final thoughts. Did he feel terror? The simple animal fear of non-existence that comes for everyone? Or did he feel a sense of completion, a satisfaction that he had finished his great work and was now passing into the history he claimed to have foreseen? We can imagine him in the darkness, his breath ragged, the vast, terrifying panorama of his visions, perhaps replaying in his mind. The fires, the floods, the monstrous births, all of it now culminating in this small, suffocating room. His death was the ultimate paradox, a superhuman legend, concluding with a deeply, pathetically human end. As he had requested, he was interred upright in the wall of the Cordeliers church in Salon, a final act of eccentricity that ensured pilgrims and curiosity seekers would visit his tomb for generations. He had successfully curated his own exit, turning his corpse into a monument. The man was gone, but the myth, now sealed and completed by its author's own predicted demise, was just beginning its long, strange journey through time. In death, Nostradamus became not a historical figure, but a battleground. His legacy is a profound conflict of interpretations, a war of narratives that has raged for over 450 years, with each generation and culture remaking the prophet in its own image. For his believers, for the disciples of the esoteric and the paranormal, he remains the ultimate proof of human precognition. They see him as a genuine seer, a man whose mind was miraculously able to transcend the boundaries of time. They pore over his quatrains, armed with anagram decoders and historical timelines, convinced that they are unlocking a secret, divine code that proves his omniscience. For this global community of believers, he is Saint Nostradamus, the patron saint of the future. At the opposite extreme are the academic historians and professional skeptics. For them, Nostradamus is the ultimate case study in cognitive bias and the power of suggestion. They evaluate him as a clever 16th century poet who masterfully exploited the anxieties of his age. They point out that his successful prophecies are always identified in hindsight, that their language is so hopelessly vague it can be retroactively fitted to almost any major event, and that the vast majority of his nearly 1,000 verses are so nonsensical they are simply ignored. To them, he is not a prophet, but the father of a literary genre, the creator of a psychological inkblot test onto which people project their own fears. The conflict also plays out on a national and political level. In France, he is a figure of national pride, a mysterious genius who is part of their cultural heritage. Yet, as seen with Goebbels, his work has been co-opted by foreign powers for sinister ends, turning him into a tool of psychological warfare. In the English-speaking world, particularly in American pop culture, he has been transformed into a doomsday prophet, his name synonymous with disaster films and end-of-the-world television specials. The Nostradamus of the History Channel is a very different figure from the Nostradamus studied by scholars at the Sorbonne. He is a testament to the fact that a text, once released into the world, has no single owner or meaning. He is a mirror, and the conflict over his legacy is simply the eternal argument humanity has with itself about the nature of truth, fate, and the possibility of knowing the unknowable. So we return to the core question, the central dramatic paradox of his life. How did a provincial apothecary see humanity's future? The final comprehensive answer is that he didn't, not in the way a clairvoyant would, but he accomplished something far more complex and enduring. The solution to the paradox is not a single key, but a fusion of extraordinary talents and historical circumstances that created a perfect storm of prophecy. First, we must acknowledge the foundation, the man of science. Nostradamus the doctor possessed a keen, analytical mind, trained to observe, diagnose, and identify patterns. He didn't just apply this to the human body, he applied it to the body politic. He was a voracious reader of history, from Livy to Plutarch to contemporary chronicles. He understood the diseases of states, how economic hardship leads to unrest, how religious fanaticism leads to war, how the ambition of princes leads to the graves of commoners. He saw that history did not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymed, driven by the timeless, unchanging passions of human nature. Second, this rational mind was shattered and reformed by profound, personal trauma. The loss of his family broke his faith in a purely material world and opened his mind to the irrational, the mystical, the possibility of a hidden order behind the visible chaos. This trauma gave him the motivation, the desperate need, to seek out this hidden order through the esoteric arts. Third, he possessed an undeniable poetic genius. He was a master of language, not in the classical, elegant sense, but in a far more potent way. He created a unique prophetic language, ambiguous, symbolic, layered with multiple meanings, and resistant to easy interpretation. This was his greatest tool and his greatest defense. It allowed him to create verses that could lie dormant for centuries, waiting for an event to which they could be attached. He did not predict the future. He created a flexible linguistic framework that could accommodate nearly any future. Finally, he was the right man at the right time. He lived in an age of extreme anxiety, a world desperate for answers, willing to believe. The invention of the printing press meant his words could spread like wildfire, far beyond the reach of any ancient oracle. In essence, Nostradamus was a brilliant synthesizer. He fused his deep understanding of history's patterns, the science, with a powerful, trauma-driven visionary impulse, the mysticism, and encased it all in the armor of poetic ambiguity, the art. He did not hold up a crystal ball to the future. He held up a dark, clouded mirror to the present. And for nearly 500 years, humanity has stared into it and seen its own fears, its own violence, and its own destiny reflected back. What, then, is the ultimate verdict of history? What is the universal lesson of the life of Michel de Nostradame? His true, enduring prophecy was not about the rise of Hitler or the events of September 11th. It was a far deeper and more unsettling revelation about the permanent condition of humanity itself. The lesson is that we are, at our core, pattern-seeking animals adrift in a sea of chaos. We are terrified by the idea that history is merely one damned thing after another, a random sequence of events without meaning or purpose. We have an unquenchable thirst for narrative, for a story that connects the past, present, and future into a coherent whole. Nostradamus did not provide that story, but he provided the raw materials for it. His genius was in understanding this fundamental human need. He created the ultimate psychological toolkit for imposing order on a disorderly world. The enduring power of the centuries is a testament to our own desperate need to believe that the future is not a terrifying void, but a text that can be deciphered, that our anxieties are not just our own, but are part of a grand, pre-written cosmic drama. He teaches us about the immense, terrifying power of words. He demonstrated that a well-crafted phrase, sufficiently ambiguous and resonant, can take on a life of its own, shaping the course of events, inspiring hope, justifying slaughter, and echoing for centuries after its author has turned to dust. The verdict of history is that Nostradamus was the ultimate realist. He saw humanity for what it was, a species driven by fear, ambition, and a desperate hunger for meaning. He did not prophesy our future. He diagnosed our nature. And his diagnosis, written in the strange, dark poetry of the 16th century, remains as accurate today as it was the day it was written. His life is the story of the clash not between civilizations, but between our desire for certainty and the universe's stubborn insistence on remaining a mystery. The final frame is not of the man, but of his creation, the ghost that outlived him. Imagine a vast, silent library, perhaps the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. A librarian pushes a cart through canyons of books, the wheels making the only sound. He stops and retrieves a small, leather-bound volume from a shelf. It is an early edition of Les Prophéties. He places it on a table, and a single beam of afternoon sunlight, thick with dust motes, illuminates the page. The camera moves in, slowly, over the archaic French, the strange ligatures of 16th century print. The words are cryptic, alien. From the depths of the west of Europe, a young child will be born of poor people, he who by his tongue will seduce a great troop. His fame will increase towards the realm of the East. The camera continues to push in, the focus softening, the individual letters blurring until they are no longer legible. They become abstract shapes, a texture, a pattern without discernible meaning. All that is left is the impression of a secret, a code just beyond our grasp. The flame of the candle in his study and salon went out over 4 centuries ago, but the shadows it cast would stretch across all of subsequent history, their shapes constantly shifting, forever reforming themselves in the anxious eyes of every generation that dared to stare into the darkness, searching for a prophecy of their own end or a promise of their own beginning. His legacy is not an answer, but the eternal, haunting echo of a question posed to the future.